Hi, everybody. I'm Sally Herships. I'm the head of the audio program at Columbia Journalism School. Thank you so much for joining us live from our living rooms or wherever you might be. Here with me tonight is our very wonderful moderator, Cardiff Garcia, host of the Indicator, Planet Money's podcast, Mei Fong, who is, as she described it, my partner in crime, co-executive producer of the Heist at the Center for Public Integrity, and Andrés Caballero, a documentary filmmaker and audio journalist, and audio journalist. So thanks so much. I'm gonna turn things right over to Cardiff.
All right. Thanks, Sally. And welcome to everyone. This is a really exciting conversation that we're about to have about a really interesting project. I think it's the first time I've worn a shirt with a collar in 6 months. That's how excited I am about it. And there's a lot of different things that we can cover here. And to be clear, the conversation is not going to be about what's in this podcast series, which is about how the legislation of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was crafted and its effect on people, but rather about the journalistic approach to putting together a series like this. There's a million different angles we can cover here, so I'm just going to limit myself to a few so that we can leave as much time as possible for questions. And here's how we're going to handle that. As we get close to roughly the 40-minute mark, so as we start approaching roughly 7:10, if you have a question, just type in the chat, I have a question. Don't type out the whole question itself, just type, I have a question. And then that way, when we unmute all of the mics later, we'll call on you one by one and we'll say, hey, so-and-so, what is your question? And then you can jump on here and ask a question of the panelists. So here's where I actually want to start. This podcast series is a collaboration between a group of reporters, investigative reporters, that primarily works in print or in the written word, in text, on the one hand, and then another group of investigative reporters that primarily works in audio. Those collaborations can be tricky and challenging. I've been a part of a lot of those, and the way that you tell the stories can be so different in those two formats that it makes for sometimes a very difficult collaboration, but also one where the journalists from both sides can really learn from each other in terms of how to put together a story like this. So, Sally, my first question is actually for you, and it's about a kind of amusing thing that you told me the other day, which was that when you were first approached by Mei and by the Center for Public Integrity about collaborating, you were actually worried that it would be kind of a tough slog. And so you turned it down at first. Very rude of you. Why don't you tell us why that was and sort of what your approach was to putting this thing together as a collaboration between audio and print?
Sure. So I have to preface my answer by saying I'm so glad that eventually things worked out, and I've had such a blast working on this. But yes, when Mei Fong first called me up from the Center for Public Integrity and asked if I would like to produce a project, an audio podcast project with a group of print reporters, my answer was, thank you so much. I don't do that, but I can recommend some fantastic people. And Mei proved to be persistent and called me back, or I don't even remember, it's been so long now. But obviously things ended up this way. But my concern was that audio and print journalism or text journalism now are really, really different, right? And if that's a new idea for you, just imagine this. Pick up a copy of the New York Times or open up a copy of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal and read it out loud and ask yourself how long that would be compelling to listen to. So text or print journalists are incredibly skilled and audio journalists are incredibly skilled, but the way that we do things is really, really different. So print journalists, when you're training them to write for the ear, one of the things I'll say to them is like, you have to unlearn every single thing you've ever learned. Like, we don't really focus on things like grammar. And if you're going to use a comma, use a period instead. And you can't just take a tape recorder and put it down on the table. There's a whole other layer of production that goes along with this, where you have to think about audio quality. We can't just call people up and talk to them on the phone. So that was kind of my hesitation at first. Did that answer the question, Cardiff?
Yeah, and I think as a real quick follow-up before we bring Mei in, do you want to give a couple of examples of how things end up being so different in audio? Like the idea that the stories, I think, tend to be a little bit more linear. You can't do as many, caveats and tangents. You really have to focus on one thing. And also the editing process is so different. So yeah, can you give us a couple of examples?
Mei, I think that question was for you.
No, that was for you. That was for you, Sally. It was a quick follow-up.
Okay, yeah. Okay, sure. So a print story is like a Christmas tree. It has all these branches. You can go down, all these little paths you can go down. And an audio story is like a Christmas tree with the branches all cut off. Like, it sounds like a lot less fun, but I promise you it's not. We all know it's not because we love podcasts, but you have to stay, like Cardiff mentioned, being linear. You have to stay on a straight path. So there are all these little details that have to go to the wayside. So with Andrés, his story about American Airlines, which is gonna be published tomorrow, he could have just gotten on the air and read a list of details. Like, I'm gonna make up these numbers because I don't have them in front of me, but like American Airlines did $155 billion, that's wrong, $150 million in buybacks and 2017 as a result of the tax bill. And then it gave, $200 million in bonuses. And that was 6% of the company's profits. And now we're going to tell you how much the salaries were for the CEO and the COO. And you get, like, you're already bored, right? So we have to really pay attention. We have to be very selective with details. And we can't include all of these the more intricate details that a print story would include. Is that helpful?
Yes, it is. In May, Sally there noted your persistence. What sort of convinced you that the work that your colleagues at the Center for Public Integrity, the work that they were doing, would work as a podcast? And were you sort of aware of all these differences between how to tell a print story and how to tell an audio story going into it?
I knew there were differences. I think Sally schooled me some more on more of those differences. But just to dial it back a little bit, Cardiff, you and I have a little bit of a history here, right? Because the first time I was on your podcast when you were at Financial Times, and I was talking about a book I'd written about China and the one-child policy then. And so in that sense, that was a challenge too, because, if you talk about the one-child policy, it's a huge policy, lots of demographic figures, population figures, 30 million this, 1 billion that, and so on. So my challenge with the book was to take those figures and turn them into stories that people cared about, people outside of China, people who may have necessarily known a lot. And, at that time when I was doing it, podcasts weren't that big a deal. I mean, if you think about it, podcasts, the whole explosion in the market has really been in the last 5 years only, right? And so by the time I was on and talking to you, I'd done my book, I was on the book promo tour, but I was thinking to myself, man, if I had those resources to tell that story again, how would this look like audio? Would this sound like? How would that story be told? And so I was very, very interested in the whole idea of how we could make things, tell stories in different mediums and touch audiences in different ways. When I joined the Center for Public Integrity, the center is a long-time, well-revered, Center for Investigative Journalism. We spend long periods of time doing deep investigative work, lots of data. We do a lot of data journalism and parse it into stories we can tell. I mean, some of our most famous stories have to do with numbers, a lot of numbers. And so the challenge was, how do you take those numbers and tell the story, right? And I saw podcasts as a really wonderful medium for us to do that. We had Alan Holmes, who is also on this call, and we spent years reporting very deep stuff on the 2017 tax cuts, which, if you think about it, oh my gosh, numbers galore. But at the heart of the story was a story about inequality. This was a major lever, something that would take a lot of billions of dollars of taxpayer money and put it in the camp of the wealthy. And so that was the challenge of the story, to make that come alive. And, I think that's what really endeared Sally to me when we talked about this project, when we finally got going. She asked me, I think one of the first questions was, what do you want the listener to feel.
See?
Yeah, see? I always keep saying reader, right? What do you want the listener to feel when you listen to this podcast? And she said, outrage. And I was like, I want this woman. I'm going to get this woman to work with me by hook or by crook.
Yeah, great. And Andres, I want to bring you in as well. You know, your background very much is in audio and in broadcast. You've made documentaries, you've worked for radio. When you were brought in, what appealed to you about this project, given that it is a project about tax policy and macroeconomics? You know, it's a challenge to make something like that interesting. So what sort of, what brought you in and convinced you that this was a project that you wanted to pursue?
Sure. So Sally reached out to me with the idea of taking on an episode for this. And I think my first reaction was similar to hers, in the sense that, you know, this is interesting. I hadn't really looked into it as much in terms of how, you know, the magnitude of this tax cut and what it implicated for everybody. But from a radio perspective, it was kind of a nightmare, right? How are we going to make numbers look, you know, sound interesting? And, you know, I knew the direction we were heading, but it was also a challenge, and I like challenges. So I said I was in, and as I started reporting, I think I got lucky that the episode I had to take on was more focused on, you know, the workers and the people, right? Are we better off since this was passed, this bill? And so that's how I you know, I think when you have that ability to focus on people and those most impacted, and you have you know, and this happens to be American Airlines, then you have a chance to hear from a flight attendant. That already makes it more interesting. Let's try to get into this through the perspective, the lens of these characters. So in that sense, that made me more excited. And then as I kept reporting it, yeah, I kept running into all these, like, I can't put all these numbers, but I can't lose any of these either. So that's, you know, it was still a challenge, but I became more interested as I learned, you know, about where all this money went, and also the relevant, or how relevant this story is to the times we're living. So it made me, as a journalist, want to be a part of this even more.
Yeah, and I want to give viewers a quick background on Andres's episode, which actually drops tomorrow. It essentially follows the path of executives at American Airlines and workers at American Airlines and their differing experiences and how they were affected by the tax bill. Andres, as you were putting together this episode, can you give us a sense of just like how much work goes into something like this? It's a 30 to 40 minute episode, right? It includes a lot of figures, and it also includes a lot of reporting. I mean, is this like a 2-week project, a 2-month project? Give us some sense of what goes into it.
Yeah, this is definitely, I would say, even longer than a 2-month project. I started reporting this right before, you know, COVID, or around the time that COVID hit. And, you know, it was quite a challenge. But can you repeat your question one more time?
Yeah, I just wanted to give
complexities you're saying. Yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
to give people a sense of how much work goes into like one
sure.
30-minute episode that has so many different variables involved.
Yeah. So, for example, just to give a sense, I mean, for a 30-minute audio piece like this, you're talking maybe something like a 20-page script. And that's just a visual marker, but a lot of elements, also the complexity that this involves. We're talking, you know, we are talking about a specific company like American Airlines. We're talking about corporations. We're talking about sources, people who decided to trust us and speak to us, where there are also a lot of, you know, complicated elements to take into account in terms of what it means for them, even when this gets out there. So that's just as another example of the level of detail involved. And then you think, you know, immediately when you start reporting a piece like this, in mine specifically, I was thinking focus on, you know, personal stories. And then eventually, you know, once you feel like you have the main character who can take you on this journey into this other world, more complicated world, once that happened, then you start thinking of, you know, who are the voices that we need to hear from in terms of experts who have been covering this for a long time, who can see things more clearly, and then it went in that direction. But those are just some examples of the process and what it takes. Also, making sure that everything that you're doing has a bigger purpose. What is it exactly that we want people to get out of this at a time, and why now, right?
Yeah.
So all these elements that I'm sure many journalists are familiar with.
All right, great.
Can I just sit here for 1 second? Is that okay?
Of course it is.
Okay.
Yeah, you can do whatever you want. Go for it.
I want to add, I think this is something I feel so strongly about, like, as someone who's heard from a lot of people, at the J school, sometimes people will come into my office back when we could go to our offices, but now via Zoom, and be like, oh, I just want to make a podcast. Like, I'm just going to get out my recorder or my phone and record myself. So just to give people a quick sense of an added layer in addition, and Cardiff, I know you know all about this already because you do this every day. Cardiff's podcast, for anyone who's not heard The Indicator, it is a daily podcast. So they do this every day, which kind of blows my mind. But there's a whole production level on top of everything that Andrés is talking about. It's not just finding sources. It's not just fact checking. I will play you the beginning, like 15 seconds of our Sonic logo, just to kind of give you a sense of what I'm about to talk about. I think you'll be able to hear it.
Yeah.
From the Center for Public Integrity.
This is The Heist.
Okay, so just for the Sonic logo, just to give you an example, forget the other 30 minutes and 41 seconds. This is Andrés's episode. We had to write a script. I had to share the script with Mei and Alan. We had to find voices to record. That was actually Andrés's voice. We had to work with a composer to do a digital version of the music. Once that music was approved, she then worked with real live musicians, like a cellist, to record the music. Then that all has to get put together and sent to an engineer who puts it together, makes a mix. The engineer who's in London sends it back to me. We listen to it, we approve it. Like, it's a lot. And it's different than writing text, right? So I have this QuickTime window open. That's why I look sort of weird, like I'm peering over my Zoom screen. I have this QuickTime window open behind my Zoom screen, and I see this QuickTime version of Andrés's episode. It's 30 minutes and like 55 seconds. Anytime we go through a version of that, I have to sit there and listen to all of it in real time, and not just me. So does Mei, so does Andrés. We have a producer. We have editors. Like, they all have to do this. Every time we make changes, we have to listen through. So it's fact checking. It's make sure for clarity. Like, it's a very involved process and tremendously different than print. Thank you, Cardiff.
No, that was great. It is a very time intensive process. And to be clear, you can start a podcast without going through all of these things. There's a pretty good chance that podcast won't be very good. Right. So that's what I would say to that. But this is actually a helpful segue to a question for you and for Mei, Sally. And I'm not asking either of you to badmouth your colleagues that you've worked so hard with or to give anything away. But I'm wondering if you could share maybe some points of friction or some disagreements you had about how to put together a story like this, where you had to really sort of talk to each other and communicate about what could be included and what had to be excluded that maybe you would have loved to have had in there. Are there any examples that come to mind?
Mei, you go first.
I was gonna go give it to you. I mean, we definitely had discussions, and I can't think of anything that sort of jumps off the top of my mind, because I always felt like Sally and I were very in sync and in thinking this through. And also, especially as far as audio is concerned, I defer a lot to her judgment on a lot of these issues. There were some issues where we talked about, like, maybe fact checking or saying, okay, can we say this? I don't want to get sued. The Center for Public Integrity has a pretty, I don't want to use the word state, but we are pretty, well known and niche. So we are we have to be careful about these things. We have a section of fact checkers and things. We are very proud of the fact that we have a solid reputation in the journalism business. So sometimes, you know, it can, we can, you know, so it's like two different speeds. All right, can we say this? Can we really say this? What about if we, no, that sounds way too lawyerly and caveatish, you know, and that's also partly a transition from print to saying it and calling it like it is. But I can't think of any major issues that we had over this. I mean, we were able to talk it through and work it. And I think the important thing is, you know, I think what you say is podcasts is a lot of work. You have to get together a big group of people. There's very little that you can do just on your own, but you have to find a good partnership. I think that's very, very clear. You have to find people that you can work with, that have your vision, that share your vision, and you can do so much more than, you know.
Okay, great. And let me ask about sourcing now, because there were a lot of really interesting choices made. There were a lot of really great gets, especially in the first episode. For people who haven't listened to the Heist yet, the series yet, in the very first episode, there's a long discussion with a guy named Doug Deason, I believe, and he is a big Republican donor who gives millions of dollars to these dark money super PACs. And, you know, what he said may not come as a shocking revelation to a lot of people, but the fact that he said it out in public in a very kind of casual and friendly way was quite surprising, where he just said, look, I give all this money for access that other people don't have. And not only do I give the money, I threaten to withhold the money if these politicians aren't doing what I asked them to do. And then he also bragged about having, you know, the phone numbers of, you know, 20 or 30 senators and countless other people in Congress in his cell phone. And I thought it was really interesting. It's a great get. And he is portrayed in the episode as a very friendly guy. I think the reporter, Sarah Kleiner, I think, actually says he's a very friendly guy with some not very sympathetic, I think, views, or at least his views on access are not very sympathetic. So I'm curious to know how you went about sort of getting him to talk to you, and why you chose to make a whole episode featuring Doug Deason. Sally, I don't know if this was your call, but if you want to take that one.
Yeah, I think this was all of our calls a team, but I think the way Sarah went about getting him was just like, a lot of times with reporting, I'm sure anyone here who's a journalist knows this, it's a numbers game. And if you reach out to enough people, the idea is like, ultimately, the hope is somebody will agree to talk to you. So we did a similar episode where before the pandemic, we wanted to talk to a billionaire. So we just started emailing billionaires, and like eventually we found a billionaire who agreed, was like, sure, I'll talk to you. Cause there are all these, we wanted to talk to two billionaires, one billionaire who loved Trump's tax bill and one billionaire who hated Trump's tax bill. And we got the billionaire first who hated the tax bill. Usually people who are angry about something are more willing to talk. And that was just a numbers game. Like I made a list in Google Docs of billionaires and, you know, started contacting them. And we finally got connected to this billionaire. I'm blanking on his name. He's from Silicon Valley. No big surprise there. So I think what Sarah Kleiner did was something similar. She just reached out to people until she found this guy who said yes. And like Cardiff said, like, we know people give through dark money, but what's so surprising and so fascinating is the way he just talks about it so nonchalantly. And she called him back. She called him because in the first interview, she was going to fly down to Texas to interview him in person. And then the pandemic hit and we had all these other questions for him. Like, does he give to dark money and, you know, other things. And so she asked him if he would talk again. And he said, yes. And in the podcast, when she talks about how he's such a nice guy, you hear her explaining, he's such a nice guy. We do these things called iPhone syncs, where you have the source record themselves on their iPhone using the voice memo app, because the tape is really good quality. So like, he was even willing to do that. And he knew that listeners to this podcast were not going to be sympathetic to his perspective. And he talked about that, but like, he was such a nice guy that he recorded himself on his cell phone.
Yeah, I'm just going to add to that by saying that I think this is an example of why, you know, this marriage of audio and print journalism was a really good thing, because behind the audio podcast is actually 2 years worth of investigative work that the center did on taxes. So a lot of these people were people we cultivated, people we'd spoken to in the past, people who had read our work and were familiar with it and respected and were therefore willing to talk to us, people we knew that we could ask and maybe they would say yes. I mean, so in that sense, you know, I mean, like to put together this podcast, we would say was, I started talking to Sally in January, and we knew that we had a quick timeline on this because we wanted it to come out before the elections, right? When people would be thinking about all these topics. But before that, there were 2 years worth of really tough investigative work done by people like Alan Holmes and his team. And I think that you can hear it, you know, you could not put that depth of reporting in just 9 months worth of work. That's 9 months plus 2 years, because I mean, in episode 3, we're talking about Bob Corker and all the ins and outs and the backhand kind of, backpeding and agreements that sort of led to something, you know, so momentous happening so quickly among the back corridors of power. You could not get that kind of access or understanding without some very deep work and preparation beforehand. So that's one thing.
Yeah, and here's a real quick follow-up before I bring in Andrés. Did you tell people like Doug Deason and, you know, later on Art Laffer and people who were unlikely to be portrayed as having views that were sort of, you know, whose views were not likely to be portrayed sympathetically on the show, did you tell them that the name of the podcast series was The Heist? Because I can imagine that they might be a little bit more reluctant if they heard that, because they might think, well, God, am I the person pulling off the heist in this thing or what?
That's a good question. I spoke with someone from a really far right-wing think tank. Is it the American Enterprise Institute? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah.
And I was very straightforward with them. I was like, this is called The Heist. And like, we're probably like gonna see things a little differently. And we did write a letter to the Treasury, because I've been asking for interviews with Mnuchin for months, the Secretary of the Treasury, and finally wrote, and they didn't respond. But I didn't just say it's called The Heist. I wrote an email like this long detailing all of the reporting findings, like, your nickname is the Foreclosure King, and you are accused of foreclosing on tens of thousands of Americans illegally. Like,
right.
So that was a step further, I guess.
Yeah, and Andrés, I want to ask you about your episode. You mentioned a second ago that you really liked this approach of talking to real people, right, about how they were affected by this tax cut, and not just talking to, you know, to academics or to executives. But you actually brought in sort of a full sweep of views into your episode. You did have American Airlines employees who spoke with you about their experience. And then when it came to the views of the executives or the actions taken by the executives after the tax cut, I think you relied a bit also on archival footage that you had to look for. So can you kind of give us a sense of your own approach to putting together the different types of sourcing in your episode?
Sure. So the things were smooth in the sense of being able to, you know, get in touch with American Airlines workers like flight attendants, pilots. I spoke to gate service agents, and mechanics as well. But then I think, you know, once I had this story, you know, I had a few talking heads. What was missing really was the voice of, you know, American Airlines itself. Obviously, that's crucial for a piece like this. And I had already been reaching out to American 2 times actually, and they rejected interview requests with CEO Doug Parker, who had been, you know, the face of this company, and he's probably one of the most prominent CEOs in the industry. He took over American Airlines in 2013 when it merged with US Airways, and so you have, you know, the fact that he's been there since 2013 until now. It's a figure who could help, you know, through his lens also tie things together, at least from the perspective of the company. And that was obviously a dead end. And so we had to figure out how can we still do justice to this and be able to get everything in there. And the perspective of American, they eventually reached out and answered a couple of the crucial questions that we had, but it was one of those statements via email and a little bit of information. So the challenge was, you know, I sat down and I had already been compiling a lot of archival footage of Doug Parker and all the interviews he had given even before 2013 when he took over, where it showed the way that he was talking about business decisions of the company. It showed a trend through time from then to today, a specific style of running things that may be representative of also many other corporations, because American Airlines isn't the only one that managed things in a certain way that didn't really help out the workers, let's just say. So Doug Parker ends up being a character in this story, but it's through all these interviews that I was able to compile, and obviously making sure the context is intact, and also in a way he becomes a character, but also a time marker for what the company was doing at that time, in a parallel way as the characters do. So he's prominent, peppered throughout the piece.
Yeah, and a quick follow-up on that too. For the voices that you did have, that of the workers, can you give us a sense of how you went about, writing them into your script and into the piece in a way that made the piece sort of unfold naturally and made it interesting and full of suspense and a certain amount of tension as well? Can you give us just some idea for people who haven't done that before of how you take all these different quotes that you had, which must have been hours and hours of quotes, and actually choose the ones that work for you?
Well, I think you want to think of, why are you speaking to this person? And once you have, you do the interview, you have the tape, you try to find this sort of, narrative arc, right? What story, what narrative, what story do they bring into this entire narrative where you're piecing this whole piece together? And so Deborah Volpe, who was the flight attendant at American, she had been there for 33 years. So that also helped in the sense that she had been around for a long time, not just at American Airlines, but she experienced, up until today, since she started working, 3 mergers and 4 recessions. So she was also someone who could, and besides the fact that flight attendants seem like very interesting people, I've always wondered and been fascinated by that profession. And so I think that helped, pepper her through different, the different narratives, the narrative arc of the piece. And I think she was articulate. She was genuine as well in the way she expressed herself. That helped out. It also helped, reflect a prominent voice out there right now of American workers who feel like they've been cheated. And even though they want to work, they want to do well, they have pride in what they do, but they're still angry. And they know that something has to change. And so I think that's the tone that we get from Deborah. So she takes us through the history of American Airlines. She takes us through, all these ups and downs of the company, and through her lens, from when she got that job, finally, that was, something she romanticized, to, hitting a wall of reality, and then to all these ups and downs until, even her story is extremely relevant to the pandemic and when it hit, and being in the place where she's in today, that we're seeing, a lot of cuts and furloughs of workers, many of them flight attendants in the industry. So she was a great, a character to take us into all those more complex notes.
Great. I've got a few more questions for the panel, but we're getting close to 7:10. So if you're in the viewing audience and you've got a question, just type in the chat for us. Hey, I have a question. And in just a few minutes, we'll call on you and we'll take some of those questions. Mei, my next question is for you, which is a question about how you choose what to prioritize in a series like this, because the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which is often referred to as, the Trump or the Republican tax bill or the big corporate tax cut, actually did a lot of different things, right? It wasn't just the corporate tax cut, and it was hundreds of pages long, like a lot of these pieces of legislation are. And you could see a lot of different competing interests and influences going into the crafting of a piece of legislation like this. So when you were looking at like this massive thing, how did you go about deciding, okay, we'll devote one episode to this, another episode to that? Sort of take us through your process.
With numbers, you always want to get to the people behind those numbers, right? That's what makes for really good storytelling. So Sally and I and Alan and our whole team, when we discussed this, we always agreed we wanted to make this personality focus. We wanted to talk, and then you start with, how did this come about? Who benefited? Who got shafted? And you start looking for people within those places to explain that. So every one of our episodes has almost a central character, right? Stephen Mnuchin, the guy who puts the douche in fiduciary. That was one of our best quotes. Bob Corker, the deficit hawk from Tennessee, who used to say that, getting international debt was worse than a North Korean nuclear invasion. And for this episode, the folks in American Airlines, Andrés got this really engaging Deborah Volpe. If you listen to her on tape, she's like talking about the part where she said, all these airline workers get paid so little that they'd be nicking toilet paper from the cab, from the toilet. So this is one reason why you're flying American Airlines and you don't have any toilet paper. Now you know why. And Doug Volpe and Doug Parker, even though he didn't give us an interview, we have archival footage of him. There's description. You feel like you're in that room with him when he's dressed like Keith Richards and performing "I Can't Get No Satisfaction" with all his top executives at a American Airlines party. These, so it's people. It's the people behind his numbers. It's the people who are affected. That's always going to be good storytelling. So that was the prime motivation.
Okay, and then Sally, my last question before we turn to audience questions is just, was there any point in time when you were freaked out about being able to make this an interesting series? In other words, not just a very revealing and enlightening series, and it's definitely that, but it is a series that also really flows well, and that's not easy. So I guess my question is, was that a particular challenge in taking on this project, and sort of how did you overcome it, if so?
I think I was worried in the very beginning because it's about taxes. And when people hear taxes, let's be honest, like, can I see a show of hands? Like, raise your hand right now. So I see a bunch of people in the audience: Gabriella, Brian, Anna, Janice. I'm just reading names: Shamson, Elaine, Kwasi, Nancy. Like, raise your hand if I said, like, who wants to hear a podcast about taxes? I don't see any hands. Okay.
Nobody.
So that was my initial concern. But then when I talked with the team and we realized this isn't about taxes, it's about the way, it's about how power works in Donald Trump's America. And that's what it's really about. And it does make you outraged. So we had to get around that issue. And like Mei said, we had to find people who are really impacted by it. So like when we talk about, that's why we decided to focus on a character in each episode, because like I said earlier, if I just started talking to you about tax policy, and if I started talking to you about the corporate tax cut, you guys would all log off right now. But if I told you that Stephen Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury, has, I can't remember the exact number, but it's like something crazy, like 48 executive producer credits as a Hollywood producer. He produced the Lego movie, Batman versus Superman, like all of these
wife with the long gloves,
Right, and his wife with the long gloves. Like, you guys, that's how we started the episode. Like, you might have seen this picture of Stephen Mnuchin and his wife at the Bureau of Engraving holding up sheets of money, like he's just signed the dollar bill. So that's how we got around that, by focusing on, like, who is this guy? Like, how did a Hollywood producer who's already super wealthy, has been married 3 times, like has really no record of public service, has a nickname of the foreclosure king, how did this guy become the Treasury Secretary? So that's how we got around that.
All right, excellent. Also drove a Porsche to high school.
Yeah, red.
Red Porsche. Okay, so we are going to unmute all the mics, and we'll call on you to take questions. If you can do us a favor, we're going to unmute the mics from our end, but if you're not the person who's asking the question, if you could voluntarily mute your mic on your end, just so there aren't a lot of, so there isn't a cacophony of background noises all at the same time, we'd appreciate it. So I'm going to go look at the chat, and we'll just, we'll call on somebody. So, all right, starting with Here's a question from, I'm sorry if I mispronounce this, from Quasi, asked at 6:59. You actually wrote in the question. If you want to ask it yourself, you can, or I can read it. Quasi, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here. It's Kwesi.
Quasi, apologies.
Yes. My question, a bit of it has been answered already by Professor Herships, but why do you think Doug Deason was happy to talk? Did he have any sort of like motivation to talk?
The only theory we have is that this was already something that had been reported on publicly. So Doug Deason, in shorthand, was part of, when President Trump was on the campaign trail the last time, one of the promises he made was that he was going to provide this big tax cut to corporations. He got into office, it didn't happen, and big donors like this guy Doug Deason, who were very rich, got really unhappy. They were like, deliver, we want this, and it wasn't happening. So they started speaking out very unusually. So it had already been publicized a little bit. Like, politicians were kind of freaking out and tweeting and saying, like, we have to pass this tax reform or our donors are gonna like not give us the money we need to get reelected. So it had already been publicized a little bit. So it wasn't completely unknown, and even says that in the podcast. You can hear he references that. I think the other reason is, like, you know, I don't know. I'm never going to be able to get inside Doug Deason's soul, but like, I don't know that he really thinks he's doing anything wrong is one possibility. Like, it's just what he believes is okay. That would be the most positive perspective, I think.
All right. Next question is from Elaine, 708. Elaine.
Hi, thank you. Oh, 708? Oh, the time. Yeah, I'm curious to get your tips on what works in putting the right team of people together to do this. Because I think it's really critical to get the right team, and what mistakes maybe you have made at points along the way that you've learned from about that.
Mei, you wanna take a shot at this one?
Well, I think, you know, you should approach it the way most of us are journalists here, right? And we know how to report a story where we find the best sources, right? We kind of know, all right, this guy kind of really knows what's going on. I'm going to ask him first. This guy is a real blowhard. He's going to give me PR guff. He doesn't really know what the crap he's talking about. If you don't have that good instinct as a journalist, you're going to be a crap journalist. I think you should apply that very same rule when you're building a team of people. When you look for people who are talented, know their stuff, and can pull together and make a really great thing. So that's the skill set you kind of need to have. And I think most of us are developing it or have it. And if we're not, we shouldn't be in this business. And we can apply that to building a team in the same way. You kind of look for, you have to read people well, right? I mean, otherwise we're in the wrong profession. So I think that would be the thing. You sort of you assess, you ask around, you find the best source of information. You talk to them. You can tell if somebody's telling you BS versus somebody who kind of knows their craft. And that's the starting point. Find the right people. If you find the right sources, your story will be good. If you find the right people, your project will be good. That's kind of like a 80% rule. And then the other 20% is sort of, and the other part of it, which is kind of my purview, which part of the job is funding this project, building the money to pay all these people and pay them well and not give them complete starvation wages, and making sure that we have enough resources to make this a really good project. Podcasts, if you want to do them well. And, you know, this is, I think, a question that I asked initially and I never got a good answer for. And I think a lot of people still don't. How much does it cost to produce a good podcast? You know, and you get all sorts of answers, 3,000, 5,000, 100,000, you know. This American Life apparently costs like $100,000 per episode to produce, you know. So you kind of have to find the right medium and fundraise enough to give people the right resources so they can do things. And that's a part of the whole process of putting together, I think, a good team.
And before we go to the next question, we've got a note here from Alan Holmes of the Center for Public Integrity as well, saying he's got a follow-up to that. Alan, you want to jump in?
Sure, just real fast because I know we're running short on time. But when Mei and I were going through all the proposals, what's jumped out to us about Sally was she approached stories very similar to the way I like to approach stories, and many of the other editors like to approach stories, which has been talked about, is that we create characters based off the data. This is an incredibly dull subject. I'm going to tell you, I've been covering this for almost 3 years. But what Sally did was that she said, we're going to tell the story through characters. And that immediately jumped off to me and to Mei, saying, this is the person we need to go with, because it's the only way we're going to get people to listen to this thing. And what we then did, we handed over to her. We aren't radio experts. We're not podcast experts. And we had to really kind of trust her that she's going to do this in a very professional, very high level quality way. And that's the one thing I told Mei when we started this, is that I don't want to get embarrassed. I don't want to be embarrassed if we put something out. Sally went, I'm going to just say, Sally went way above any type of expectations I had. This thing has been blowing up. It's been doing great. And I think that's where it started off, is that she matched what we wanted to, how we wanted to tell the story. And she just did a fabulous job and is still doing so. So that's how I approached it.
Excellent. Next question from Gabriella.
Hi. So in Cardiff's last couple of questions to Mei and Sally, this was sort of touched on in Alan's most recent answer, but I think you all three talked about the challenge of making it interesting. You all knew that this was going to be a challenge to make the story interesting as a podcast, but that's all after somebody decided that it should be a podcast in the first place. What did you identify in this story that said to you, this should be a podcast? Because there's a lot of stories that have to be told in print because the information needs to be communicated to the public, but not every story has to be told as a multi-episode podcast. So what were the elements that you checked off that said, yes, this works, or this needs to be done?
Sally, you want to jump in here?
Sure. So succinctly, which episodes? Can you, just rephrase that?
Oh, what were the elements? You talked about the challenge, that you knew it was going to be a challenge to make this interesting as a podcast, but it was decided to make it into a podcast. So what were the elements about the story that said to you guys, this is going to work, this should be a podcast, this story is worthy and it will work as a multi-episode podcast?
Sure. I think just shorthand, it was a big fumbling mess, kind of like a Viking raid or the sacking of Rome, that is really illustrative of how the Trump administration works. And when people hear taxes, they get really bored and look away. But ultimately, this affects every single person here who's in the United States and maybe even outside of the United States, depending on the economy of the country. And so that's how big picture, it just seemed really clear. Like it seemed really, I was outraged listening to it. It was basically just a deal that served the very rich. That's pretty outrageous, right? Like if I told you, Gabriella, like, hey, hope you don't mind, the administration's cutting a new tax deal. You look like a middle-class person. You're probably not going to do very well. Maybe your kids and your grandkids are going to end up with an enormous tax bill. But if you know of any corporations, they're going to get a massive tax break. They're going to make hundreds of millions of dollars. We're cool, right? That's all good, Gabriella? Yeah, can I get your vote? Okay, so big picture, that's outrageous. And an election's coming up, like potentially the most important election of our lifetimes, not just in this country, for the planet, potentially because of the environment and all sorts of other things. And the guy who passed this tax bill is like presenting it as an accomplishment and he's running for president again. So it seemed important. And,
we've all of us probably have been transfixed before the recent developments by the New York Times blockbuster series on Trump's personal taxes, right? And how the guy paid next to no federal taxes for many years, and $750 in his first year in his presidency. And raise your hand if you paid more than that. But here's the thing, right? The guy who pays what's his personal tax rate, that's kind of important, but he's also the guy who determines what you pay, and also what corporations pay. So, okay, so maybe the guy didn't pay any money for his taxes. That's maybe not so heinous, but he's also the guy who made it so that Amazon paid zero, Netflix paid zero, and then it really gets heinous. So I think that's a determination of what makes a really good story. If your blood pumps and you go, that's outrageous, this is enormous injustice, that's the story you want to do.
I'm going to real quick skip to a question a little further down before coming back because it's a quick one. It says, Cardiff, please read my question. This is from Lori. How did you decide on the order of the episodes?
Oh, that was, I think, fairly easy. It's the history of in order of the passage of the bill. So
yeah, but we also we got thrown by a loop in a sense because COVID happened, right? So and so we kind of were, on one hand it screwed things up for us because we couldn't travel, we couldn't report, and but at the other hand I was like, hey, this is a really good opportunity because now we are starting to see. In other words, we were going from handouts to bailouts. We're talking about the same issues again. The government is giving out money, and some of that money is not being given in very wise ways. We're talking about the PPP, and suddenly, it was meant to be for small businesses to help them out in the pandemic. But suddenly you're like, hey, why is it that Potbelly and some of these like million listed corporations are getting that money, which is your money, your taxpayer dollars? And so in that sense, the arc of the story began in 2017 when, and now it's coming back full circle. Our last episode will be talking head on about pandemic, aid money. Where does your money get spent to help us get over this?
All right. This next question, skipping back up, could be a good one for Andrés. It's from Gifty, a Ghanaian journalist, who says that I should read the question. Here's the question. I would like to know what your thoughts are on producing an audio piece that easily fits on TV. Working as a multimedia journalist, what works for radio does not really work for TV. Andrés, if I can slightly repackage the question, you've made documentaries, audio and video documentaries. So you want to just give us some thoughts on how you would approach something like this for audio differently from how you would approach a documentary or an episode like this for video?
Yeah, I mean, specifically this was a tough example, but I think with video, you have the ability to maybe even, make things more appealing in terms of like, you can try to do things with the visuals and the documents that you come across in investigative type, reporting. I think there's nothing like seeing people's faces. I think in terms of, for many, credibility and so on and so forth. For me, it doesn't make much of a difference, but I think it really depends specifically on the type of project that you're tackling. I have had in my first 2 documentaries that I made, they were all ideas that were first conceptualized to be for audio and radio. And there was, for example, my first, I did a piece for StoryCorps in my last documentary about an Afghan interpreter. And, StoryCorps is just, no narration, just 2 people talking to each other. One of those characters was incredible. You couldn't see his face, but his voice was very appealing. He was very sincere, very engaging. But then I said, okay, well, this is a bigger story, a much bigger story. This guy can actually hold, say, a 30-minute broadcast documentary or a feature-length documentary for all these reasons. He's got what it takes. He's got the elements to this narrative arc that lead you to the bigger picture you're trying to make. And so and I know I'm going in the weeds, but these are some of the thought processes that go on when you're gravitating between radio and the visuals. I think each one has its challenges. And I think that, the best thing is to focus on characters. And usually you can tell a story in both mediums, but you don't want to force it because some characters may be really good in front of the camera as well, and others may not. If you put a camera in front of me, I freak out, but I do it to people all the time. If you put a microphone, I feel a little better. And so that's the reality of human beings. And so it really depends on what you're trying to make.
All right, excellent. Well, we've got exactly 2 minutes left, and I thought I would close with a simple question for all three of the panelists, which is just, now that you've started, and I think you're almost finished working on it, you still have some episodes left to drop. What are the things that you want listeners to take away from it? And if you want to give some thoughts on how that might have changed as you started working on it, that'd be great too. 2 minutes left, so everybody's got just about 40 seconds. Sally, you want to go?
Sure. I think with the election coming up, what's really important, I think the Trump administration has a reputation as being very inept and clumsy. And I think sort of big picture here, what's very clear to me through all of our reporting and all of the episodes, I sort of talked about a Viking raid or the sacking of Rome, is that whether or not it's ineptness, the speed and lack of care with which decisions are made that impact all of us are really dangerous and can be tremendously damaging. So I hope that listeners of the podcast will take that away.
Mei?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's very easy to be dazzled by all the things that are happening and have tremendous whiplash with this administration. It's like, oh my God, he's waving, he's doing something, he's got, his hair is poofy, is it falling out? He spent $70,000 on his hairdresser. And those are the fascinating details, I will admit, but some of these changes in policy are going to impact us regardless of who comes into the administration next. Regardless of who wins the election, we are going to have $2 trillion debt to pay off. So, these are important things to sort of highlight. These are lasting impacts that we need to think about beyond the flash and the $750 he did or did not pay for his taxes. These are things we need to know. And that's what I like to take. I like listeners to take that away.
Okay. And Andrés?
Yeah, I want people to think about, I mean, obviously the times we're living in lead you to process everything that happens through a certain COVID lens, if you will, of your own experience and the things that are happening inside. But I think this is also an opportunity, when you hear of this, outrageous story that on the radio, this thing that is happening, our money being spent in a certain way. I think that many Americans are reaching a sort of this boiling point. I actually hope, because I think that is how you can make changes. I think the big story, with the tax cuts is a big element of it is accountability. And so, like Mei was saying, any administration can be in, but if the methods, if the mechanism exists, that is the foundation is solid to keep everybody accountable, no matter who's in power, I think that is that can really make a difference. And I think people want to figure out how to push for those mechanisms that make politicians accountable, that protect their money. And so I think we are going into that time. I want people to look at this in sort of how can we, instead of continuing to do things the same way, how can we, instead of just reforming little bits here and there with laws, how can we reimagine the entire system, one that is, has more integrity and that serves the public interest rather than, executives.
All right, excellent. Sally threw in a message here saying that she and Mei and Andres can hang for an extra few minutes if anybody does have additional questions. So go ahead and type in there that you have one. And while we're waiting for that, I'll just note that I think a recording of this conversation is going to be available to see, I think, after 2 or 3 o'clock tomorrow. Ross, tell me if I'm wrong. So if you know of some people who might have been interested in doing this, but they had a bad sense of priorities and they did something else instead, you can tell them that it will be available to rewatch tomorrow. So yeah, and let's see. Sally, I hate to disappoint you, but I'm not seeing any additional questions. Everybody's saying thanks. We're out of here. we're gonna go watch the debates or whatever. So yeah, so let me just say thank you to everybody for joining us. This was a really, really fun chat for me, and I hope you learned as much as I did, because this was really great. So
Thank
yeah,
you, Cardiff. Thank you.
got
So
it.
much
Thanks,
for doing
Cardiff. Thanks, everyone.
this. Thanks, Russ.
Vote.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Listen.
Oh, yes, listen, The Heist, wherever you get your podcasts.